Mordhau, or as I like to call it, Mordhau! It means murder stroke in German, and in spite of the name, it just means to bonk your opponent with the wrong end of your sword. However, it is also a video game. Mordhau channels that same primal instinct that compels all men to pick up sticks in the woods and start decapitating the grass with it. There's just something in our DNA that makes us like sharp pieces of metal and dressing up like tin cans, and for that, Mordhau is happy to oblige. It's an interesting specimen that's worth examining, but the real reason I'm making this video is because I wanted to pretend that I've actually gotten something out of all my time playing it. You might remember Mordhau from its brief stint of popularity on Twitch around the time of its release. It peaked at around 60,000 players, but almost 6 years later, it peaks around at 1,500. That's quite the drop, but still, it's managing to hang in there, which is more than could be said about most multiplayer games. However, the most salient reason for this precipitous fall would be the difficulty and the interminable rift between beginners and veterans. To illustrate this point, here's me dueling someone who's got a measly 40 hours in Mordhau. Granted, they haven't played in years, and I pulled them in just for this demonstration, but even with neutral posts, it's difficult to predict the unique attack speeds of each of the 50 billion weapons until you've fought them 100 times. And while I condition him with easy ones, all it takes is to slather a little sauce on that swing and it's over. No one is reading an Evening Star Excel right off the bat. You can see how confused he is. And if they parry early, that's when you hit him with the drag. It's not like I'm trying to show off, because there's plenty of people who can make me look just as bad, but the point is, do you really think you have a chance? In case it wasn't obvious, Mordhau is a melee slasher in which you try to swing your weapon and hit people with it. It's worth mentioning that the in-game tutorial is complete trash and doesn't even explain most of the extremely important mechanics. There's 8 different attacks, being a stab, then overhead, horizontal, and underhanded swings. The other 4 are just the same from the other direction. If you hit someone, you'll do damage based on your weapon, what part of their body you hit, and what armor they're wearing. There's 4 tiers of armor and about 1 million different weapons, plus the tank perk which reduces damage, but all that matters is that if you hit someone enough, they'll die. Naturally, people don't like getting hit, so they'll try to parry your attack. Parries stop an opponent's attack at the cost of some stamina, and the only catch is that it's on a cooldown and is only active for half a second, so you'd better time it right. If you successfully parry an attack, you'll be able to riposte immediately and send back a much faster attack. Then your opponent can parry that and riposte themselves, and there you go, now you're going back and forth until one of you runs out of stamina. However, there's more tricks at your disposal. If you hit Q while you're still winding up an attack, you'll feint it, and if your opponent fell for it and parried, you'll be able to hit them before their parry's available again. However, feinting costs stamina, and if your opponent isn't falling for them, you'll eventually find yourself disarmed. So you can attack and you can defend, but you can also do both at the same time. If your opponent winds up an attack, you can mirror the direction that they're attacking from with your own attack and not only block it, but also already be attacking. That's called a chamber, and it has the added benefit that if your opponent feints, you can often punish it and land a hit. There's also morphs where you can turn a stab into a slash or a slash into a stab, but that's about it. Except, oh yeah, the most important mechanic in the game that the tutorial doesn't even mention. Alright, so when you swing, there's a wind up and a release. The release is when you can actually do damage with it, and it swings from one side of the screen to the other. It's very simple. If you start with your weapon inside of them, it'll hit your opponent as soon as possible, but if you hit them at the end of your swing, it'll hit them as late as possible. The first one is called an excel, and the second one is called a drag, but if you just do this, your opponent will read you no problem. So that's why you move your weapon while it's still swinging. Your opponent only has a limited parry window, and so if you trick them into parrying early and move your weapon away from them until their parry goes down, you'll get a hit. Likewise, if they were expecting a drag and you suddenly explode it into their face, you can catch them before they parry. You might listen to all of that and think, wow, that sounds really complicated, but that's not even touching on things like combo feint to parry, chamber buffering, overpower, double parry stamina regeneration, the miss detector. So with mechanics like these, it's obvious that Mordhau is a game that's spiritually invested in high-skill gameplay and rewarding experience, and the first major issue with this design philosophy is accessibility. This wasn't an accident. The developers of Mordhau were originally Chivalry players, and anyone who's played it before can see the similarities. Chivalry was released in 2012 and wears its age, but it's got a similar system of parries, feints, drags, and ripostes. This video isn't about Chivalry, but it's important to mention because Mordhau was essentially made out of spite, and that's because the Chivalry mechanics were a little broken. It had things like reverses where you could stick your opponents while they were behind you, and so pro fights ended up being these ballerina knights spinning around each other trying to land an unreadable hit, whereas public matches ended up being one tryhard Beyblading through half the lobby. So were these issues addressed in Mordhau? Kind of. If you try to spin too hard, you'll get glancing blows which barely do any damage, and there's a turn cap of how much you can spin with any given weapon. Plus your weapon isn't active to do damage until it's in front of you. You might look at all these mechanics and find them extremely overwhelming, but in the context of learning, they're actually not that difficult. It's not like you're dropped in and suddenly asked to perform a perfect chamber morph feint right off the bat. Unlike something like Cogmind, where you need to spend a great deal of time digesting mechanics like coverage, integrity, heat dissipation, and volley speed to be effective, it's much easier to understand. Sorry for bringing up a roguelike out of nowhere, but it's the best example I've got that I've also done a video on. While both games are mechanically complex, when you lose Cogmind, it's usually not because of your immediate actions, but rather something you did 2 floors ago without realizing. Conversely, Mordhau is very upfront with what killed you, because you're looking at it, and so the operant conditioning is a lot easier to get into your head. You died because your opponent feinted you, or you didn't read a drag, or you just didn't parry with the correct timing. In fact, it's probably better than arena shooters in that regard because you need to be so close to your opponents, excluding archers at least. It presents the information you need to improve very clearly, and so naturally the longer you play, you'll start slowly adjusting your playstyle as you get more familiar without even realizing it. At the most basic levels, all you need to do to kill someone is get behind them and swing a war axe like a maniac, but as you play, you'll gradually encounter things like, I should probably learn to actually block attacks. Then if you're forced to fight someone head-on, you might start realizing that you need to riposte to actually get an attack in. If your riposts aren't landing, you'll naturally think that you need to try something else, and so you'll start feinting. Then you'll move on into morphing, chambering, and dragging. It's an iterative process, and while it can take hundreds of hours to get the muscle memory required to pull off most tricks, at no point is it particularly confusing. That is, assuming you're playing against someone similarly skilled. The most common sentiment I've heard from beginners fighting veterans is that they just seem untouchable, and that's not to say that they're only untouchable because of their skill, which is also true, but more that they can't even understand why they're like that. Let's say you get a little bit more skilled and start chambering attacks. Your opponent feints, and you think, great, I can get a free hit in because I chambered it and you can't parry once your weapon is swinging, but then they just parried again like nothing happened. It's because if you feint, you can immediately parry, and so if I recognize that you're trying to punish my feint with a chamber, I can just feint my second attack before it enters release and then parry again just fine. There's lots of little quirks like this, and you just need to figure them out, like fast kick versus slow kicks or extended parry. It's not unheard of for high-skill games like this to have more technical knowledge, but it's an issue when you can't figure out the mechanic just from looking at it, and the tutorial doesn't even say anything about it. Beyond mechanics that you simply don't know yet, it's very difficult to learn anything when you get instantly obliterated by a Maul Excel to the forehead. When the game was in its first month of release, everyone was more or less equally skilled, and while there were some alpha testers or Shiv pros that would dominate the whole server, they were mostly drowned out by the flood of new players. It was completely different to the Mordhau of today, where anyone with under 1,000 hours is basically a free kill. Some people would look at Mordhau losing about 80% of its players in the first 2 months as some kind of failure on the game's part, but I think it ever having that many players was the strange thing. This kind of mechanically complex competitive game is always going to appeal to a smaller but more dedicated audience while pushing away the casual player. However, when the game first came out, it was much more casual than it is today, so it was able to cheat this and enjoy broader appeal for a while. It was much easier for anyone to join in and enjoy themselves, but as time went on, the players that started only 1 month ago are going to be way beyond those that were just joining, and so the stratification had begun. That gap only gets wider with time, and so the beginner experience gradually gets worse. When around release, it would have taken you only a few hours to be able to win your first 1v1, 6 years later, almost all of your opponents are going to have hundreds or thousands of hours. This is an issue that every competitive game encounters, and the solution is always matchmaking. Anyone who's had a younger brother knows that you need to let them win at least a little bit to keep them interested, and I can tell you that these people are not winning that often. Of course, you can't flatly define winning as kills, because maybe your definition of winning is running around as a dwarf and getting your head chopped off, but generally you're going to be happier the more engagements you survive. This is why it's pretty much a no-brainer for competitive games to add in matchmaking to try and match people with similar skill levels. Even though several intellectuals disagree, you generally deserve the teammates you get matched with. I could argue this point myself, but thankfully Activision was kind enough to publish a paper on the subject. If you're interested, just read it yourself, but that being said, the gist of it is they turned off skill-based matchmaking and observed a marked decline in player retention. You might see where this is going, and that's because despite being a game that emphasizes skill as an integral part of its philosophy, Mordhau does not have skill-based matchmaking. Okay, technically there is a dedicated duel mode that has matchmaking, but literally no one plays it anymore. It's not unheard of to go without it, and it does make the matches more relaxed since you know your MMR isn't at risk. This was the norm back in the day of Quake or Counter-Strike where you just joined the first server you saw in the browser, and in my opinion, the addition of matchmaking was the worst thing that ever happened to Team Fortress 2. So this isn't to say that it's strictly necessary, but that Mordhau has an accessibility problem with no means to assuage it. Even if they wanted to implement skill-based matchmaking, they simply don't have the player base for it. With only a couple hundred players per region still playing, that's obviously true today, but even when it was at its peak it would have been unrealistic. From its design you can tell that Mordhau considers the massive brawl to be one of its core tenets. The standard server size is 48, but there's still 64-player servers or even 80 occasionally, even though they run like ass and anyone who knows how to play avoids them. Most notable games that incorporate skill-based matchmaking have team sizes of 4, 5, or 6. 24 to 40 is quite the range to try and ensure that everyone is balanced, and while it may have been possible at its peak, even a month later any attempt would have become pointless. So basically, anyone who wants to get into the game is going to need to spend dozens of hours digesting mechanics in order to even survive for more than 2 seconds in a fight. Once you've been playing for a while, you just get the feeling about some people, and I'll tell you, any noob cut walking around with a tier 1 helmet is immediately categorized as a walking health ampule for my bloodlust perk rather than a threat. That's fine though, right? It's got dedicated players, and anyone who's truly interested in clawing their way up with hard work and practice can eventually join the elite few and struggle against true challengers, and yeah, okay, I'll tell you right now that for all of my talk of Mordhau's core philosophy being one of those high skill ceiling games, Mordhau is pretty awful at higher skills. Realistically, you get good enough to obliterate low levels and then just do that. Of course, this is all just my opinion, but competitive Mordhau is completely dead. It had tournaments with prize pools and casters back in the day, but even back then I was like, I don't think so. It just never struck me as interesting enough to command the attention from people outside of its sphere. I mean, something like Rocket League is easy enough to understand as a casual observer, and while the true depths of the strategy and mechanics are going to be lost on them, why players are professional is usually obvious. Compare that with the highest rank of Mordhau 1v1s where both players are just spamming bastard sword feints at each other. It's carefully controlled and there's tons of experience and strategy on display. It looks kinda stupid, doesn't it? The counter to this argument would be the success of esports like Dota or League, where there's 1,000 different characters with a million different abilities filling the screen with billions of particle effects. They're not exactly easy to get into either, but still, those have the advantages of having hundreds of millions of players already that understand the mechanics. But beyond that, I think even for an ignorant observer, the ebbs and flows are still easier to pick up on. This is mostly me just arguing from the assumption that one is popular while the other one died, so presumably there's some reason for that beyond random chance, but even as a Mordhau player, I never found the competitive scene that interesting. If you look at what got the most views on YouTube, people didn't enjoy watching pro players fight other pro players. What they watched was pro players obliterating noobs. It's a primal instinct, isn't it? You want to watch that and imagine that it's you, that you're that untouchable and have the power to dominate whole servers without any of the effort required to get there yourself. Seeing that even at that level you'd still need to struggle, that's just not as appealing. When all of the challenge is in correctly reading your opponent, inevitably you're going to end up at a race to the bottom to find the most unreadable attacks. It's not like I've ever played competitively, but there's just so much that irritates me about high-level Mordhau, like being able to screw up your overhead excel but hit the ground so that you can punish them with a kick for daring to think that just because you screwed up they could attack you. Then you have misses being unpunishable, so you can just flail around like an idiot without ever losing initiative, but the biggest one of them all is red parries. Red parry is just the community name for when you type m.debug parry 1 into the console, which I don't recommend you do because knowing will only piss you off, but it's basically when you parried in time but your parry didn't reach the server so you get hit anyway. If that happens with that debug option enabled, it'll appear on your screen, so when I parry, get hit anyway, and read that it was 24 milliseconds off, I can sigh knowing that someone with 24 less ping than me wouldn't have gotten hit. And when most serious weapons can kill fully armored builds in 2 hits, that is a major disadvantage. Ping is always an issue in competitive games like these, but let me tell you, no game has ever made me so aware of 40 milliseconds quite like Mordhau. You want 40 milliseconds? There it is, but in terms of fighting, that is an eternity. It's so important here because in Mordhau, timing is everything, and for every extra millisecond of ping you have, that's one less millisecond you have to read a feint or an excel. If you don't have the ping, some feints are actually unreadable. Like, if you try to hard-read bastard sword stab feints, you're just gonna get red parried every time, and if you try to parry earlier to compensate, you're at risk of getting feinted. There physically isn't enough time to read it to compensate for the delay. This isn't me coping, I've gotten wrecked by people with worse ping than me. It's just pointing out that some people will have an enormous advantage simply because of how close they are to the server, much more so than other competitive games. It's extremely discouraging fighting someone with 20 ping and knowing that they've got a 4-frame safety net that you don't have. The genre that is the most similarly ping sensitive would be fighting games. That's because, once again, timing and reaction speed is a major part of the challenge. However, fighting games have much more tools to deal with it, using things such as rollback netcode. This has its own issues, and resulting in some people straight up refusing to fight players that aren't using Ethernet, but it's still better than the alternative. Now look at something like Mordhau. When someone gets red parried, what are you gonna do? Suck all 48 players back in time by 2 frames to correct it? It's just not feasible from a networking standpoint. Mordhau does have a lot of networking tricks like smoothing frames for laggy players so that their attacks don't teleport all over the place and prevents intentional lag switching from being a tactic, but your ping will always be a hard ceiling on how well you can read. Seriously, this might sound like a whole lot of fuss to make over 2 or 3 frames, but it's really not. Well, that's why I hate trying to take the game too seriously, and despite being so enamored with skill, Mordhau feels actively unfun to play at higher levels. But let me dispel another myth while I'm at it, that Mordhau is actually hard. Here's my ultimate build, 1-1-3 War Axe with Rush, Bloodlust, and Flesh Wound. Here's what you do, you run around, and then you attack the enemy from behind. That's it. Seriously, to get my point across, I did not parry at all, and I only used horizontal swings, playing in third person, constantly sniffing the floor. I did not parry, I did not feint, drag, excel, or chamber, at least not intentionally, and I was still able to get 3rd place on the leaderboard and twice as many kills as deaths. These aren't beginners, mind you. Pretty much all these players know how to play proficiently. Sure, there's some meta things that still helped me, like map familiarity and footwork, but the point remains, you can do better than most players with hundreds of hours with just a little patience to go around instead of barreling straight in. This brings me to my ultimate point, and that's that Mordhau has an identity crisis, or at the very least sends mixed signals. Everything about it is proclaiming this high-skill gameplay as you're told about all the mechanics, all the weapons, and all the tactics. You're gonna see them all done to you about 1,000,000 times, so you're abundantly aware of the power gap between you and anyone you want to kill. It really feels different compared to shooters, and that's because while you might get capped the instant you peek out by an expert, you can at least understand that if you shoot them, they die. But in Mordhau, they can just stare at you and there's nothing you can do. It's very intimate. If you're ever caught at a 1v1 against a veteran, you'll be forced to accept the futility of all your attempts. So it's screaming at you, get good, get good. Yet at the same time, the game limits you to 101 FOV explicitly out of spite for the Shiv pros that would turn up the FOV to like 200 so that they could see behind them to pull off reverses. It's 101 because someone complained that 100 was too low, and so they cheekily increased it to 101, which alone is pretty indicative of their mindset. There's also loads of throwables that you can just lob at people to bypass that whole skill requirement, and pretty much every suggestion that the professionals have made to improve high-skill gameplay has been summarily ignored. I'm not saying that balancing towards fun is wrong, they're trying to avoid the same mechanics that killed chivalry, but at the same time the message is, we want you to get good, but not too good, so that begs the question of, who is this game for? Well, it's not for professionals, and it's not for beginners, it's for the players that learn just enough to stomp public matches. Again, it might not come across in the video, but you need dozens, if not hundreds of hours to not get immediately crushed. You're only really having fun when you're obliterating someone worse than you, so rather than a struggle to the top, it's more like a pyramid of players punching down all the way. But the problem with that is that eventually you run out of the people at the bottom. Part 1 was why you shouldn't start playing it, Part 2 is why you shouldn't keep playing it, but here's Part 3. So if you've made it this far, you might question, why do you even play this game? And this statement might be a bit shocking, but it's because it's fun. There's just something about Mordhau that's difficult to express. It feels like I can't go 2 matches without something stupid happening. It's got that strange concept that's as nebulous and amorphous as its namesake. It's got soul. While I do think it breaks down at higher skill levels, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that carving through the entire enemy team isn't satisfying. If that's all you want to do and you're willing to put in the effort, then by all means. But apart from that, it's got this ineffable quality that draws me into it. There's something in the water. Mordhau players are a special breed, and you'll never find a more eclectic mix of tryhards and try-not-at-alls. The closest comparison is TF2 with its friendly heavies, spy crabs, and conga lines, but Mordhau has its own flavor. You can just walk up to someone on the enemy team, and chances are they won't even attack you. There's bards playing music everywhere, and I've spent half the game twerking next to the objective, and no one's killed me. It's really quite strange. It's partially because it's so intimate an experience, where most of the time you need to be staring your opponent down if you want to kill them. It makes killing a friendly a little more personal if you can't just snipe them from across the map. And it also helps if the friendly is 200 levels over you, and to kill them you're forced to stand in unfriendly range. But beyond that, you'll just see things like this spring up all the time. There's some people dedicated to killing bards and friendlies, but even those are an important part of the ecosystem. Because if there weren't antagonists, standing around doing nothing with the enemy team wouldn't be as special. I've mentioned the intimacy, but the other culprit is how well you can express yourself into the game. There's so many builds and so many stupid things that you can do that you'll never be wanting for playstyles. You can be the tryhard halberd, the tryhard executioner sword, or the tryhard Zweihander. But if you get tired of trying hard and you're looking for a challenge, you can choose the peasant perk and lock yourself to no armor and only weapons like frying pans, forks, and big pieces of wood. It's fun, and I think more games should include the ability to actively gimp yourself so that's even more embarrassing for your opponents. Seriously, some games will spend the whole time hurling rocks at people while laughing the entire time. Beyond the builds, there's just so much expressiveness to the emotes and voice commands. I feel like this sort of expression is important for people to get truly absorbed into games. It's not something that really gets you hooked at the start, but it's something that helps retention. Even though it's mostly adversarial, multiplayer games are still a social space, and subject to all the rituals of posturing and pretension that humans are known for. This is why people buy hats in TF2 or skins in Fortnite, but to me that's all caught up in the same base desire to express yourself. Whether that's for your personality or simply because you want to show off your burning team captain, it's all the same. So something as simple as these emotes and voice commands really bring a lot spiritually to the game. Also, there's the community. Reading Mordhau chat is guaranteed to raise your IQ by 10 points. The people who play Mordhau are interesting to say the least. When you're down to only a couple hundred in each region, you're gonna start seeing some familiar faces. And shout out to Shefra. Always wears the same ginger afro, isn't the best at the game, but always plays engineer, always builds spawns, and always goes for the objective no matter what. Seriously, I've got recordings spanning 2 years, and I swear he shows up in every single one. Anyway, Mordhau is an interesting specimen. It's a casual game that thinks it's a competitive game. It requires dozens of hours to digest the mechanics, but it's still pretty casual because despite being able to 1v1 everyone on the enemy team, my KD ratio is still usually around 3-1 or 6-1. So while I'm killing a lot more than I'm dying, I'm still dying pretty consistently. And that's because fighting 2 players at once who know what they're doing is almost impossible. You're constantly getting stabbed in the butt and people are throwing things at you. Compared to my days of destroying TF2 lobbies, it's honestly way less stompy, seeing as you can't just camp spawn with a pocket medic and crits or something. Seriously, if you hate someone who's really good, all you need to do is make a character with nothing but throwing axes and the resupplier perk. Trust me, they'll love it. Despite actively balancing towards the casual experience, the developers intentionally carried over mechanics like feint to parry from Chivalry without even explaining them properly in the tutorial, so they're almost unapologetic in their insistence on skill. It's got this nut-up-or-shut-up attitude, even though when compared to other highly competitive games like Dota, Counter-Strike, Rocket League, or Tekken, no one really cares about the highest skill brackets. The ranked duel system died out hardly even a year after it was implemented. Like, I know this is all my own opinion, as someone who, despite wrecking lobbies, still gets dumpstered by the pros, but it's pretty damning to me that no one's wanted to play ranked duels for years, while the public lobbies and duel servers remain active to this day. Seriously, I cannot think of anything more indicative that competitive duels aren't fun to the majority of players than spending 30 minutes queuing to find one other player and then the round ending because my opponent was AFK. It really makes me appreciate how important matchmaking is to gradually lift players up, and yet at the same time how it would have ruined what makes Mordhau fun, just screwing around in public lobbies doing whatever you want. Mordhau is kept alive by the small but dedicated community, and while it's hardly the numbers that it had when it first started, 6 years after release, most games would kill for 1,000 concurrent players. That being said, I think because all of the techniques required to defeat your opponent are fundamentally based in deception, it opens the door to many cursed problems where the way to truly excel is to break the game as much as possible. I feel like it shows a lot about the player experience and just how much people are willing to put up with because they can get a funny kill every once in a while. It's an insight into skill-based gameplay, and part of me thinks that Mordhau's got a point. Instead of putting yourself through the rat race of ranked matchmaking, why not just enjoy yourself where you are? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good you are, all that matters is obliterating noobs. Yeah, that's what it's all about. Okay, bye.